Everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. I want to apologize for not having uploaded the last couple of days. My microphone stand broke, and I didn't really have an alternative way to hold up the microphone, so I had to wait for a new one to come in. But here we are. I have my new setup, and let's talk about today's chorale. So we're going to be looking at Liebster Jesu, wir sind hier, which translates to Dear Jesus, we are here. Very straightforward chorale, really not too much to write home about this one, so we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So 1 sharp in the key signature, we start on G, we end on G. I reckon we're in the key of G major here. We have a passing tone in the tenor, and that takes us to another G major chord, G, B, D, and A, this A being an accented non-chord tone, and then we have G, A, D, and A. I reckon this G is also like a lower suspension, like maybe a 11-12 suspension under the alto or a 9-10 suspension under the melody, something like that. Regardless, this is D major over F sharp, which is our 5 chord in first inversion. That takes us to E, A, F sharp, and D. This E, again, another accented non-chord tone, is just leading us to D major in first inversion, where the E is not the root of the chord, the D is. We're then getting towards our cadence. We have G, B, D, and B, which is G major. That's a tonic triad, root position, passing tones in the bass, and as we're getting ready for our half cadence, we have B, D, D, and G, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Passing tone in the alto, this sort of skip, a series of skips or leaps in the bass, take us to, actually G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. E is a non-chord tone though. That takes us to our 5 chord, D major, D, D, F sharp, and A. Next phrase, even though we see F natural here, we're still in the key of G major, ends in a perfect authentic cadence. We start the phrase off with E minor, E, B, E, and G. It's our 6 chord. We have a little bit of an interesting progression here. 6 taking us to E, B, F natural, and G. I reckon this E is another sort of lower suspension, maybe like a 9-10 suspension underneath the alto here. But I think this D is actually the 5th of our chord, and this would be G7 over D, which would be 5-4-3 of 4. Here our tonic is also operating as the dominant of 4, and this F natural, it makes a very clear statement that it wants to resolve back down to E here. It's a tendency tone. It's one of the 2 half steps in the major scale, right? So E going to F has 3 and 4, and 7 and 1 are kind of kindred spirits in that regard. So here we have the 3 and the 4 of C major, but we're still looking at it through the lens of G major. And then we get this really big leap here in the bass. We have D down to C here, which still is the root of the chord, but a lot of movement here in the bass. That'd be kind of difficult to sing, I would imagine. C, C, E, and G. So our tonic triad, or our 5 of 4, is resolving to 4. Typically speaking, secondary dominants resolve the way that they're expected to. Sometimes we see secondary deceptive progressions, but regardless, they usually resolve in somewhat of a logical fashion. That takes us to C major again. C, G, D, and G. Actually, it does not take us to C major again. It takes us to our tonic triad in first inversion. This C is another lower suspension, another possibly 9-10 suspension underneath the alto, but this is 1-6. Apologies. These 3 voices here, the C and the 2 Gs, had me, yeah, that is a G. Sorry, I just assumed that was a G, and it is a G. But no, it makes sense that the G is doubled when it is the root. But yes, moving to our next chord, we have A, C, E, and A. This might be a 2 chord. I think this E is an accented non-chord tone, and this F sharp is actually our root, making this a 7-6 chord. This is a very common progression in Bach where we see 1-6, 7-6, and 1, G, D, G, and B. Either this progression or the retrograde of this progression. I don't know which one is more common, but when you have these 3 chords in this pattern here. It's very, very common in Bach to see this stepwise motion of in the bass from 3 going to 2, going to 1, or the retrograde, 1 going to 2, going to 3. And we see this pattern also with other chords. It's really just 2 chords that share a Roman numeral on the ends of the progression, and a first inversion chord that is a diatonic step below. So we could see like 3, 2, 3, or 4, 3, 4, or 3, 4, 6, 4, 6, something like that, using this pattern. But here we have B, which is just taking the chord and very briefly putting it in first inversion. That takes us to C, E, G, and A, which is 2, 6, 5, A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. Both A and C are chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. D, A, F sharp, and A. That's our 5 chord. D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. C is a non-chord tone. It's a passing 7th, so we'll mark it. And that takes us to G major. G, B, D, and G. First phrase, fairly straightforward. The next phrase takes us to the key of D major. It ends in a perfect authentic cadence. You might hear it as a half cadence as well, but I think we're in the key of D major, namely because we see C sharps pretty consistently throughout the entirety of the phrase. We also outline a D major triad in the melody. Not really the biggest deal, like you could do that in the key of G major too very easily. It's just something that, it's an interesting way to approach the tonic. We don't see that a lot in the melodies that Bach has harmonized. So we start the phrase off with G major, G, G, B, and D, which is our tonic triad. G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have this syncopation again, where we have G in the bass. It's a lower suspension here, so it's really F sharp, A, and D, which is 5, 6. And this ends up turning into our tonic in the key of D major as well, because D is also the tonic in the key of D major. But that takes us to a similar pattern that we saw in the previous phrase. We have E, G, B, and E. You could analyze this as a 2 chord. I reckon the C sharp is actually the root of the chord, and this is actually 7, 6. And that takes us to D major, D, A, D, and F sharp. So again, 1, 6, 7, 6, 1. We see this pattern all the time in Bach, or we also see 1, 6, 2, 1 pretty equally as much as well, depending on your relationship with the harmony. I feel like 1 going to 7 going to 1 makes a little bit more narrative sense, like in the sense that 7 going to 1 or 5 going to 1 is sort of like the original tonal chord progression. It's like the root that other chord progressions sort of stem from. Dominant going to tonic being like a really important relationship in tonal music. 1 going to 2 going to 1 doesn't really have the same impact, and I feel like when only one voice is moving, I don't think that's enough to justify a chord progression in like a chorale texture. I feel like at least 2 voices need to be moving in order to bring a subdivided chord progression in this context as a possible analysis. So here we're sort of deciding whether or not this is 2 or 7, and to me it just makes more sense as a 7 chord. Either way, we go to D, B, E, and G. Kind of interesting here, we have a 2-4-2 chord, E minor 7 over D. We would expect this to resolve to a 5 chord in first inversion, which is what we have: C sharp, A, E, and A. It's pretty cool how 4-2 chords are almost always resolving this way, a 5th below in terms of their roots, and the bass resolves down stepwise. So it's usually 4-2 to a first inversion chord that's a 5th away. Down, that is, a 5th down. And this will take us to our tonic, D, A, D, and F sharp, D major, and then we get another repeated D major chord here, D, F sharp, A, and D. And that'll lead us into our last phrase. It takes us back to the key of G major, and I think pretty much the whole phrase is in the key of G major. This D, in the grand scheme of the form, is really just operating as, I wrote D here because I was talking about D. I meant to write 5. And In the grand scheme of the form, when we cadence on the dominant, a lot of the times it just serves as really just cadencing on the 5 in the the overall tonality of the chorale. Yeah, we modulated to the key of D major here, but we, from a formal standpoint, it would have made no difference if we were still in the key of G and we cadenced on a D major chord, right? Because it's still the dominant and serving as a pivot back to the key of G in the overall form. So we're moving back to the key of G. We go to a tonic triad, B, G, D, and G. G major in first inversion. B is a chord tone, G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark them. And this is where we get kind of interesting. We have another sort of F natural here, which is happening in and around the same metric point in the phrase, which makes me feel like there's some semblance of like a B, maybe A prime, B prime form here, like a balanced binary form going on here in terms of the two sections. But we have A and we have C here, which I think are accented non-chord tones. They could be implying maybe a 2-7 chord here, but I don't really think that that's what's going on. I think that these are more incidental and just a contrapuntal scenario where the chord is actually being introduced on the and of the beat. And if that's the case, we have B, we have F natural, we have D, and we have G, which would make this G7 over B, which is 5-6-5 of 4, and that takes us to 4, C, E, E, and G, so C major. So it resolves the way we would expect. And then on the and of the beat, we don't quite get a D major chord, but we do have D and we have F sharp as non-chord tones on the end of the beat, which sort of serves as a buffer in between this 4 chord and what's happening on the next beat, which is just another 4 chord, right? C, G, E, and G. So we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. It's kind of interesting to see 2 consecutive 4 chords, but do bear in mind that Bach does provide some buffer tones here. I don't think that's a technical term, but that's just a term that makes sense to me when we're separating chords that have similar functions, or in this case identical functions. We would expect this to go to some type of dominant chord, but it doesn't quite get there, but it will get there on the next beat. Passing 7th in the bass, a little passing 7th here, and A is also a non-chord tone, so there might be some semblance of like an A minor sonority here, or an E minor sonority here. I don't think it's really all too prevalent in terms of the grand scheme of the chord progression. I feel like these are just passing tones. We've just seen a lot of passing tones and non-chord tones in this chorale, and ultimately we lead up to A, C, E, and A. Another one of these arguable chords. I think this F sharp is actually our chord tone, which makes sense in the grand scheme of the progression. I've been saying grand scheme a lot, just the overall progression itself. 4 going to 7 is normative progression, just a predominant dominant tonic function, a similar progression to 2-5-1, where the chords are all a fifth apart. In a 2-5-1, all of the chords are a fifth apart, but here 4 and 7 are a fifth apart, and 7 going to our tonic, they're only a step away. But there's enough variety in the chord progression to give it like a heft, and to give it that relationship that is, like I said, a kindred spirit to 2 and 5. But regardless, whether you look at this as 2 or whether you look at this as 7, they're both sort of accomplishing the same sort of passing progression. I just feel like 7 makes more sense in this context from what I know about harmony and my relationship with the harmony. But we go to our tonic, G major, G, D, G, and B. That takes us to 5, D, D, E, and A. We just sort of have an enclosure here. Really, the resolution happens on the next beat, but we have G and E. G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. It's very common to see 4-3 suspensions over the dominant, especially when it's in root position. F sharp is actually the third of the chord, so this is where the resolution happens. C is a little delayed passing 7th, and then we cadence on G major. G, B, D, and G. And that is today's analysis. Like I said, really not too much to write home about in this particular chorale. We have 2 instances in virtually the same place in their respective phrases, in their respective sections as well, where we're getting tonic functioning as 5 of 4, which makes me feel like overall there is some type of symmetry happening here, some type of comparison to be made in terms of how the harmony might relate the two phrases together, but it's really not a tremendous deal. Just maybe it's even a coincidence, who knows. But regardless, that's really all I wanted to talk about in today's chorale. Not a super interesting one in comparison to some of the other chorales that Bach has harmonized, but beautiful nonetheless. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video as well if you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.